They say the quietest person in the room is usually the one you should fear the most. Richard Jessica, a man worth $400 million, forgot that rule. Standing in his glass-walled office in downtown Manhattan, he looked at his wife of 20 years, Charlotte, and laughed. He called her powerless. He told his lawyer to give her crumbs. He thought he was discarding a used-up housewife. He didn't realize he was declaring war on the very architect of his empire. What happens when a narcissist pushes a genius too far? Well, let's just say, his lawyer didn't just object. He turned ghost white. This is the story of the most brutal, brilliant revenge you will ever hear. The air in the conference room on the 45th floor of the Jessica Towers smelled of expensive leather and intimidation. It was a cold Tuesday in November, the kind of day where the gray sky over New York City seemed to press against the glass. Richard Jessica sat at the head of the mahogany table, checking his watch. It was a Patek Philippe, worth more than most people earned in 5 years. He didn't look at his wife, Charlotte, who sat at the opposite end. He was too busy typing a message on his phone, likely to Jessica, his 4-year-old executive assistant, who had recently been promoted to fiancé-in-waiting. Charlotte Jessica sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing a beige cardigan that had seen better days and no jewelry other than her simple gold wedding band. She looked tired. At 43, she had the face of a woman who had spent 2 decades making herself smaller so her husband could feel bigger. To Richard's right sat Arthur Artie Pendleton. Artie was a legend in the city's divorce courts. He was a shark in a 3-piece suit, known for leaving ex-wives with nothing but their maiden names and a mountain of legal fees. "Let's make this quick," Richard said, finally locking his phone and sliding it across the table. He looked at Charlotte with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "I have a board meeting at 2. Artie, run her through the offer." Artie cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He slid a thick document toward Charlotte. "Mrs. Jessica," Artie began, his voice smooth like oil. "Richard is feeling generous. The prenuptial agreement you signed 20 years ago is, strictly speaking, ironclad. It entitles you to a lump sum of $50,000. However, given the length of the marriage, Richard is willing to increase that to $500,000. Plus, he will allow you to keep the 2018 Mercedes. In exchange, you vacate the Hamptons property and the Upper East Side penthouse by the end of the week. You waive all rights to future alimony and any claims on Jessica Dynamics." Charlotte looked at the papers. She didn't blink. She didn't cry. She just reached out a hand that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something else, and touched the edge of the document. $500,000, Charlotte said softly. Her voice was raspy, unused. "Richard, the company is valued at $400 million. We built it together in our garage." Richard laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. He leaned forward, his handsome face twisting into a sneer. "We?" he asked incredulously. "There is no we, Charlotte. I built it. I stayed up nights coding the initial algorithms. I pitched to the investors. I flew to Tokyo and London and Berlin. You? You made coffee? You raised the kids? You kept the house clean. You were a housewife, Charlotte. A support system. And frankly, for the last 5 years, you haven't even been good at that." "I managed the books for the first 10 years, Charlotte whispered. "You did data entry." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "Don't confuse bookkeeping with building an empire. You are delusional. Look at you. You're wearing a sweater from Target to a meeting with the most expensive lawyer in the state. You have no connections, no assets, and no career." He stood up, walking over to the window to look out at the city he felt he owned. "You are powerless, Charlotte," he said, his back to her. "You exist in this city because I allow it. If you fight this, Artie will bury you. You'll get 0. Take the $500,000 and go find a hobby, maybe knitting." Artie smirked, clicking his pen. "It's a good offer, Mrs. Jessica. Richard doesn't have to give you a dime over the prenup. You have no leverage here, no cards to play." Charlotte looked at Richard's back. She remembered the nights in 2004 when he was sobbing on the floor because the IRS was auditing them, and she had stayed up for 3 days straight, restructuring their entire personal debt to save the company. She remembered 2012 when he wanted to sell the patent for quick cash, and she had convinced him to license it instead, a move that generated 80% of his current wealth. She looked at Artie, the shark. And then, she did something that confused them both. She reached into her purse, pulled out a cheap ballpoint pen, and signed the document. Artie blinked. He had prepared for a screaming match. He had 3 paralegals on standby to dig up dirt on her. He had expected her to beg. "You're signing?" Artie asked, suspicious. "I'm signing," Charlotte said. She didn't read the fine print. She just signed her name, Charlotte J. Jessica. She pushed the papers back. "I want out," she said quietly. "If this gets me away from you, Richard, it's worth billions." Richard turned around, a triumphant grin on his face. He walked over and patted her on the shoulder, patronizingly. "Smart girl. I knew you'd see reason. You were always practical. Boring, but practical." He checked his watch again. "Right. I'm off. Jessica booked us a table at Le Bernardin." Richard stormed out of the room, the master of the universe. Artie gathered the papers, looking at Charlotte with a lingering suspicion. It was too easy. "You have 3 days to move out," Artie said coldly. "I'll be gone by tonight," Charlotte replied. She stood up, smoothed her cheap sweater, and walked out of the heavy glass doors. As she stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on the opulent office, Charlotte's posture changed. The slump in her shoulders vanished. Her chin lifted. She pulled her phone from her pocket. It was an old model, cracked screen. She dialed a number that wasn't saved in her contacts. "It's done," she said, her voice completely different, sharp, authoritative, and cold as ice. He signed the divorce decree. The asset separation is legally triggered. Initiate Protocol 4. For the first 3 months after the divorce, Charlotte Jessica vanished. To Richard and the social circles of New York's elite, she had simply faded into obscurity, exactly as expected. The narrative Richard spun was simple and cruel. Charlotte was mentally unstable, unable to cope with his success, and had retired to some quiet Midwestern town to live out her days in mediocrity. Richard, meanwhile, was having the time of his life. He bought a penthouse in Miami. He bought a 150-foot yacht and named it the Jessica. He was featured on the cover of Forbes under the headline, "The Bachelor Billionaire." How Richard Jessica shed the dead weight and soared. But Charlotte wasn't in the Midwest, and she certainly wasn't knitting. She was in a small, nondescript studio apartment in Queens. It was clean, sparse, and filled with whiteboards. On a rainy Tuesday night, a man knocked on her door. He was tall, wearing a trench coat, and looked out of place in the rundown hallway. This was Tobias Grayson. If Artie Pendleton was a shark who swam in the open water, tearing people apart for the public to see, Tobias Grayson was a deep-sea creature. He was a forensic accountant and a quiet legal consultant who specialized in corporate restructuring for entities that didn't want to be found. He didn't have a website. He worked by referral only. Charlotte opened the door. She wasn't wearing the beige cardigan anymore. She was wearing a sharp, black turtleneck and glasses. "Tea?" she asked. "Scotch, if you have it," Tobias said, stepping inside and looking at the whiteboards. They were covered in complex diagrams, flowcharts of shell companies, and trust fund structures. "I see you've been busy," Tobias noted, tracing a line on the board that connected Jessica Dynamics to a company called Aegis Holdings. "Richard was always good at the product," Charlotte said, pouring him a drink. "He could sell sand to a desert, but he never had the patience for the boring stuff. The tax structures, the IP registration, the holding companies. He hated the paperwork. He used to say, 'Charlotte, just handle it. Just make sure I don't go to jail.' And you did," Tobias said. "I did better than that," Charlotte replied. "I protected the assets. Not for him, for the family. And when it became clear 5 years ago that he was shifting funds to buy jewelry for his mistresses and risking the company's liquidity, I restructured the ownership." Tobias sat down, opening his briefcase. "Does he know?" "He thinks he owns Jessica Dynamics," Charlotte said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "He owns the operating company. The one that pays the salaries, rents the office space, and holds the liability. But the intellectual property, the source code, the patents for the compression algorithm that the entire company is based on? Let me guess," Tobias grinned. "They are licensed." "They are licensed from Aegis Holdings," Charlotte confirmed. "A blind trust registered in the Cayman Islands. He thinks Aegis is just another shell company he set up years ago to dodge taxes. He's been signing the licensing renewal checks automatically for a decade. He doesn't even read them." And who is the beneficiary of the Aegis Trust? Tobias asked, though he already knew the answer. Charlotte pulled a binder from the shelf. The trust documents state that the primary beneficiary is the lawful spouse of Richard Jessica. However, there is a clause. Clause 14b. In the event of a legal separation or divorce initiated by the grantor, Richard, the beneficiary designation becomes irrevocable and permanently locks to the individual named Charlotte Jane Collins, Jessica, effective immediately upon the signature of divorce papers. Tobias whistled low. So, the moment he signed those divorce papers and kicked you out, he transferred ownership of his company's entire brain to me. Charlotte finished. He owns the shell. I own the ghost inside it. He's going to stop paying the licensing fees once he realizes, Tobias warned. That's the beauty of it, Charlotte said, tapping a document on the table. The licensing agreement expired yesterday. He needs to renew it to legally use the software code his clients are paying for. If he doesn't renew, or if the licensor me refuses to renew, Jessica Dynamics is selling stolen goods. Every day he operates now, he is committing massive copyright infringement and fraud. When do we tell him? Charlotte walked over to the window, looking out at the distant Manhattan skyline where Richard was likely popping champagne. Not yet, she said. He's launching the version 5 update next week. It's a global event. All the investors will be there. The stock price is going to peak. You want to hit him when he's highest, Tobias noted. I want him to feel what it's like to be powerless, Charlotte said. He told me I was nothing. He told me I was a housewife. I want him to realize that the housewife owned the house all along. She turned back to Tobias. I need you to draft a cease and desist letter, but don't send it to Richard. Send it to the board of directors, and send a copy to the SEC. Tobias smiled, a predatory glint in his eye. This is going to be a bloodbath. Artie Pendleton is going to have a stroke. Good, Charlotte said. I hope he has good health insurance. He's going to need it. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was a sea of black ties and designer gowns. It was the night of the Jessica Dynamics version 5 launch, an event Richard Jessica had spent $2 million on. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and caviar. A massive screen behind the stage displayed the Jessica Dynamics logo, a stylized golden hawk soaring upwards. Richard stood at the podium, basking in the applause. He looked every inch the titan of industry. His tuxedo was custom-made in Milan. Jessica, standing in the front row, wore a red dress that cost more than Charlotte's old Honda. She clapped enthusiastically, her diamond engagement ring catching the stage lights. Tonight, Richard boomed into the microphone, his voice echoing with practiced charisma. We don't just launch a software update, we launch a revolution. Jessica Dynamics has always been about pushing boundaries, about shedding the old to make way for the new. He paused for effect, glancing at Artie Pendleton, who was standing near the VIP bar, looking unusually twitchy. Some said we couldn't do it, Richard continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. Some said we were too aggressive, too bold. But when you build an empire, you have to be willing to cut the dead weight. You have to be streamlined. Version 5 is pure power. No lag. No baggage. The crowd erupted. It was a thinly veiled reference to his personal life, and everyone knew it. The stock price had jumped 12% that morning on rumors of the launch. Richard felt invincible. As he stepped off the stage to a standing ovation, Jessica rushed to his side, handing him a glass of scotch. You were amazing, baby, she cooed, kissing his cheek. Did you see the look on the investors' faces? They're eating out of your hand. Of course they are, Richard smirked, loosening his bow tie slightly. I just made them all 20% richer in an hour. Where's Artie? I need to tell him to expedite the purchase of the island in the Bahamas. I want to celebrate properly next week. Richard scanned the room and found Artie. But the lawyer wasn't smiling. He was huddled in a corner with 3 members of the board of directors. Samuel Dawson, the chairman, Linda Way, the head of the audit committee, and fierce old Thomas O'Malley, the largest shareholder. They weren't drinking champagne. They were reading documents. Thick, heavy documents that had just been delivered by a private courier who had bypassed security. Richard frowned and walked over, Jessica trailing behind him like a persistent shadow. Gentlemen, Linda, Richard greeted them, flashing his winning smile. Why the long faces? The stock is up. The launch is a hit. We should be toasting. Samuel Dawson didn't look up. He was a man of few words, known for his ruthless efficiency. He turned a page, his brow furrowed. "Richard," Dawson said, his voice dangerously low. "We just received a hand-delivered notice. It's a cease and desist order." Richard laughed. He actually threw his head back and laughed. A cease and desist? From who? Some jealous competitor? Oracle? Microsoft? Let them sue. Artie will chew them up. Right, Artie? Artie didn't answer. He was staring at the document in Linda Way's hands. His face had lost its usual flush of alcohol-induced confidence. He looked sickly. "It's not from a competitor, Richard," Linda said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's from a holding company called Aegis Global. They claim to own the exclusive intellectual property rights to the core compression algorithm of version 5. They say our license expired 48 hours ago." Richard rolled his eyes. "Aegis? God, you people are jumpy. I own Aegis. It's a shell company I set up in the Caymans 10 years ago for tax purposes. That holds the patents so we can license them back to ourselves and write off the expense. It's standard corporate maneuvering. If you own it," Thomas O'Malley growled, stepping forward, "then why did the registered trustee of Aegis just serve us with a notice demanding we shut down all servers immediately or face federal charges for IP theft and securities fraud?" "The trustee?" Richard scoffed. "The trustee is just a paper pusher. I'll call the bank in the Caymans in the morning and have him fired. Relax. It's a clerical error. Someone probably forgot to auto-renew the contract." "It's not a clerical error," Artie whispered. Richard turned to his lawyer. "What?" "I'm looking at the signature on the order," Artie said, his voice barely audible over the thump of the party music. He looked up at Richard, and for the first time in 20 years, Richard saw fear in the shark's eyes. "What signature?" Richard demanded, snatching the paper from Artie's hand. He looked at the bottom of the page. The letters seemed to swim before his eyes. It wasn't a bank manager's signature. It wasn't an anonymous lawyer's scrawl. It was elegant, precise, and terrifyingly familiar. Signed, Charlotte J. Jessica Soul, trustee and beneficiary, Aegis Global Holdings. Richard stared at the name. The music seemed to stop. The laughter of the crowd faded into a dull roar. "Charlotte?" he whispered. "Why? Why is Charlotte's name on my shell company?" "Because," Artie said, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his sweating forehead. "You didn't set up Aegis, Richard. You were too busy with the IPO that year. You told Charlotte to handle the boring tax stuff. You gave her power of attorney." "So what?" Richard snapped, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "She's my ex-wife. The prenup covers everything." "She waived all rights to Jessica Dynamics." "She waived rights to the company," Artie said, his voice rising in panic. "Aegis isn't part of Jessica Dynamics. It's a separate entity, a third-party vendor. And if she's the trustee, fix it," Richard shouted, drawing stares from nearby guests. "I pay you $1 million a year to fix things. Get on the phone, call her, threaten her, tell her I'll sue her into oblivion." "Richard," Samuel Dawson interrupted, his face hard as stone. "If she owns the IP, and she's revoked the license, we are currently selling a product we don't own. That's fraud. We need to stop the launch." "No," Richard roared. "We are not stopping anything. She's bluffing. It's a desperate housewife's attempt to get attention. She's probably sitting in her sister's basement crying right now." He grabbed his phone. "I'll handle this. I'll remind her who has the power." The boardroom of Jessica Dynamics was silent as a tomb. The party was still raging downstairs, but the music couldn't reach the soundproof glass of the executive suite on the top floor. Richard sat at the head of the table, his phone on speaker. The board members sat around him, their faces grim. Artie was frantically flipping through old files on his laptop, his hands shaking. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Then, a click. "This is Charlotte." Her voice was calm, clear. There was no sadness in it, no hesitation. "Charlotte," Richard barked. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm in the middle of a launch." "I know," Charlotte replied. "I'm watching the live stream. The graphics are very impressive, Richard. Though legally speaking, you're broadcasting stolen property." "Stolen?" Richard laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. "Don't be ridiculous. I built this company. I own the code. You're just playing games with some paperwork you found in the attic." Listen to me, call off this cease and desist nonsense immediately, or I will have Artie destroy you. I'll sue you for defamation. I'll take the 500,000 back. Richard, Charlotte cut him off. Her voice was like a gavel striking wood. Put Artie on the line. Richard glared at the phone. Artie, tell her. Artie leaned toward the speakerphone. Mrs. Jessica. Charlotte, look, this is Arthur Pendleton. We understand you're upset about the settlement, but this is blackmail. You signed the separation agreement. You have no claim. Hello, Arthur, Charlotte said pleasantly. I'm looking at the incorporation documents for Aegis Global, specifically, Clause 14B. Do you have it in front of you? Artie scrolled frantically on his laptop. He found the file. Aegis Incorp. 2014. PDF. He opened it. He scrolled to Clause 14B. His eyes widened. His breath hitched in his throat. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he was about to faint. Read it, Arthur, Charlotte commanded. Artie's lips moved, but no sound came out. Read it, Richard shouted. Artie swallowed hard. It says, in the event that the grantor, Richard Jessica, initiates divorce proceedings against the trustee, Charlotte Jessica, all beneficial interest in the assets held by Aegis Global shall immediately and irrevocably transfer to the trustee, free of any claim by the grantor. Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. She wrote a poison pill into the holding company, Dawson whispered, looking at Richard with horror. I didn't write it, Charlotte's voice came through the speaker. Cool and sharp. Richard did. Or rather, he signed it. It was in the stack of papers I gave him in 2014. He was in a rush to go to a golf tournament in Pebble Beach. He asked me, is this standard? And I said, it protects the assets from external creditors. Which it did, but it also protected them from him. You tricked me, Richard screamed, slamming his fist on the table. You fraud, you manipulated me. I protected my investment, Charlotte corrected. You told me I was powerless, Richard. You told me I was a housewife. You said I brought nothing to the table. Well, it turns out I brought the table, and the chairs, and the house. I'll kill the company, Richard threatened, his eyes wild. I'll write new code. I'll build version 6 without you. Go ahead, Charlotte said. It took you 5 years to build version 5. Do you think the shareholders will wait 5 years for revenue? Do you think the SEC will overlook the billions in fraud you're committing right now by selling my software? What do you want? Dawson asked, leaning toward the phone. Mrs. Jessica, this is Samuel Dawson. We have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders. What is your price? We can increase the settlement. 10 million? 20? Richard looked at Dawson, betrayed. Don't offer her that. She's bluffing. I don't want money, Mr. Dawson, Charlotte said. I have plenty of money. The licensing fees for the last 10 years have been accumulating in the trust. I have about $50 million in liquid cash right now. Artie put his head in his hands. He realized he had just given a woman with $50 million a settlement of $500,000. He was going to get disbarred. He was definitely getting fired. Then what? Richard hissed. What do you want? I want the launch stopped, Charlotte said. Turn off the servers. Now. I can't, Richard cried. The press is downstairs. The investors are watching. Then tell them the truth, Charlotte said. Tell them you don't own your product. Tell them you discarded the person who secured your future because you wanted a younger model. Tell them you're a fraud. I won't do it. Then I will, Charlotte said. I've already forwarded the documentation to the SEC and the tech blogs. Gizmodo is publishing the story in, let's see, 3 minutes. You're lying, Richard gasped. Check your phone, Richard. Everyone in the room grabbed their phones. Artie refreshed his news feed. There it was, a breaking news alert from the Wall Street Journal. Breaking, Jessica Dynamics in IP crisis. Founder's ex-wife owns source code, stock halted. Richard stared at the screen. The text blurred. His chest felt tight. She really did it, Artie whispered, looking at Richard like he was a dead man walking. 3 minutes, Richard, Charlotte said. The servers go dark, or I file the federal injunction. You have until the end of this call. Richard looked around the room. The board members were standing up, distancing themselves from him. Dawson was already on the phone with his own lawyers. Jessica was nowhere to be seen. She had likely checked Twitter and fled. Richard Jessica, the man who had everything, stood alone at the head of the table. "You can't do this to me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am Richard Jessica." "Not anymore," Charlotte said. "Now, you're just the defendant." The line went dead. Artie looked up at Richard. His face was a mask of pale terror. "Richard," Artie said softly, "the SEC just emailed me. They're opening an investigation." Richard slumped into his chair. The powerless housewife had just fired a nuclear weapon from a studio apartment in Queens, and the fallout was just beginning. The fallout was instantaneous. In the world of high-frequency trading, news travels faster than light. By the time Richard Jessica stumbled out of the boardroom, his net worth had plummeted by 60%. The scene downstairs in the grand ballroom was chaotic. Guests were checking their phones, whispering, and looking around for the exits. The large screen behind the stage, which had proudly displayed the version 5 logo moments ago, now showed a Windows error message. "License key invalid. Contact system administrator." Richard stood on the mezzanine, looking down at the ruin of his triumph. Jessica was gone. He spotted her near the coat check, frantically typing on her phone, likely trying to secure an Uber before the paparazzi swarmed the entrance. "Mr. Jessica," a reporter from Bloomberg shouted, spotting him. "Is it true that your ex-wife owns the compression algorithm? Is Jessica Dynamics solvent?" Richard turned and ran back into the elevator. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Upstairs, Artie Pendleton was having a panic attack. He was on the phone with 3 different partners at his law firm, trying to explain how he, the Shark of Manhattan, had missed a multi-million-dollar intellectual property clause in a standard divorce settlement. "I didn't know." Artie screamed into his phone, loosening his tie until it hung limp around his neck. "She buried it. It was in the definitions section of the trust agreement." "Who reads the definitions section?" "You do, Arthur," a cold voice said from the doorway. It was Samuel Dawson. The chairman of the board looked at Artie with absolute disgust. "You're fired, effective immediately. And don't bother billing us for this month. We'll be suing you for malpractice." Artie slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He was done. His career, built on intimidation and arrogance, had been dismantled by a woman he had dismissed as a knitting enthusiast. Meanwhile, in Queens, Charlotte watched the news on her laptop. Tobias Grayson sat beside her, eating a slice of pizza. "Stock is down 40 points, Tobias noted, chewing thoughtfully. "The SEC just announced a trading halt pending investigation. Richard is going to be personally liable for insider trading if they find out he knew about the IP issue before the launch." "He didn't know," Charlotte said, sipping her tea. "That's the beauty of it. He was so arrogant he didn't check. He just assumed everything belonged to him because his name was on the building." "The phone is ringing," Tobias said, pointing to her burner phone. "It's him." Charlotte let it ring. Once, twice, then she picked it up. "Hello, Richard. You ruined me," Richard screamed. He sounded drunk or hysterical or both. "Do you know what you've done? The stock is worthless. The investors are pulling out. I'm going to lose the penthouse." "You still have the Hamptons house," Charlotte said calmly. "Oh, wait, no, you don't. You sold that last week to cover the margin call on your personal loans, didn't you?" "How do you know that?" "I know everything, Richard," Charlotte said. "I did the books for 20 years, remember? I know where you hide your money. I know about the offshore accounts in Panama. I know about the consulting fees you pay to Jessica's modeling agency. And I'm going to make sure the IRS knows too." "Charlotte, please," Richard's voice broke. He was sobbing now. "We can fix this. I'll give you half. I'll give you 60%. Just reinstate the license. Please." "I don't want your money, Richard," Charlotte said again. "I want you to admit it." "Admit what?" "Admit that you didn't build this alone. Admit that you used people. That you used me. That you treated me like an appliance you could throw away when it got old." I, Richard stammered. "I built the company. I'm the visionary." "Goodbye, Richard," Charlotte said. "See you in court." The court date was set for 2 weeks later. It was the most anticipated hearing in New York's legal history. The courtroom was packed. Every major news outlet was there. Richard Jessica arrived with a new legal team, a group of aggressive, high-priced litigators from a firm known for scorched earth tactics. They were led by Marcus the Bull Thorne, a man who looked like he ate nails for breakfast. Richard looked terrible. He had lost weight. His suit looked a size too big. Jessica was nowhere to be found. Rumors said she was in Street Tropez with a tech billionaire half Richard's age. Charlotte arrived alone. She wore a simple navy blue suit, no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She looked calm, composed, and utterly unbothered by the flashing cameras. Inside, the bull immediately went on the offensive. "Your Honor," Thorne boomed, pacing in front of the judge. "This is a clear case of fraud and entrapment. The defendant, Mrs. Jessica, maliciously concealed material information during the divorce proceedings. She waited until my client was vulnerable to strike. This trust clause is unconscionable. It's theft." The judge, a stern woman named Justice Holloway, looked over her glasses at Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, did your client sign the trust agreement?" "He did." "But did he have legal counsel at the time?" "He did." "But did he read the document?" Thorne paused. "He relied on his wife, who was acting as his bookkeeper. He relied on his wife to manage his tax evasion scheme." Charlotte's lawyer, a quiet, sharp woman named Eleanor Vance, interjected. "A scheme he set up to hide assets from potential creditors. He can't claim ignorance of a document he signed to defraud the government, Your Honor." The courtroom gasped. Eleanor continued. "Furthermore, the trap Mr. Thorne refers to is a standard asset protection clause. It was designed to prevent the company's core IP from being seized in a lawsuit. Richard, Jessica insisted on bulletproof protection. He got it. He just didn't expect the bullet to be fired by him." Richard stood up, his face red. "She's lying. She planned this. She knew I wouldn't read it." "Mr. Jessica, sit down." Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Charlotte stood up. She walked to the witness stand. She didn't look at the jury. She looked directly at Richard. "I didn't plan for you to discard me, Richard," she said, her voice steady. "I planned for us to retire together. I built that trust to protect us, to protect our children's inheritance. But when you decided that we didn't exist anymore, when you decided that I was just a housewife who deserved crumbs, you triggered the very mechanism designed to save the family." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I am the sole trustee of Aegis Global. The law is clear. The assets belong to the trust. The trust belongs to me. Richard Jessica has been using my property without payment for 5 years. I am countersuing for back royalties, damages, and a permanent injunction against Jessica Dynamics using the version 5 code." The bull tried to object, but he had nothing. The paperwork was flawless. The signatures were authentic. The intent was clear. Judge Holloway reviewed the documents in silence for 10 minutes. The courtroom held its breath. Finally, she looked up. "The court finds in favor of the defendant, Charlotte Jessica," Judge Holloway ruled. "The trust is valid. The intellectual property rights belong to Aegis Global. Mr. Jessica, you are hereby ordered to cease all use of the software immediately. Furthermore, given the evidence of potential tax fraud presented by the defense regarding the creation of the offshore entities, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office." Richard slumped forward, his head hitting the table. It was over. He wasn't just broke. He was facing criminal charges. The empire he had built on Charlotte's back had collapsed, and the rubble was about to bury him. Charlotte didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She simply gathered her papers, nodded to the judge, and walked out of the courtroom. As she passed Richard, he looked up. His eyes were hollow, filled with a mixture of hatred and regret. "Charlotte?" he whispered. "Why?" She stopped. She looked down at him, not with anger, but with pity. "Because, Richard," she said softly, "you forgot the first rule of business. Never underestimate the person who knows where the bodies are buried." She turned and walked out the heavy oak doors into the blinding flash of the cameras. She was no longer Charlotte the housewife. She was Charlotte the CEO, and she had a company to rebuild. The transition of power at Jessica Dynamics did not happen with a handshake. It happened with the silence of a guillotine blade falling. On the Monday following the verdict, the atmosphere inside the 40-story glass monolith in downtown Manhattan was suffocating. The usual hum of aggressive trading and frat boy banter was gone, replaced by the terrified whispers of employees who knew the ship had been commandeered by the very person their former captain had spent years mocking. Richard Jessica was not there. At 8 a.m., federal marshals had escorted him out of his penthouse, a property now under lien by the Department of Justice. The image of Richard, unshaven and wearing a wrinkled tracksuit, being guided into an unmarked sedan, had already been splashed across TMZ and the Financial Times. The King of Code looked less like a monarch and more like a frightened child who had broken a vase and didn't know how to hide the pieces. At 9 a.m. sharp, the elevator doors to the executive suite slid open. Charlotte Jessica stepped out. She was not alone. Flanking her were Tobias Grayson, looking grimly satisfied in a charcoal suit, and a team of forensic auditors who carried bankers' boxes like weapons. Charlotte wore a suit of sharp, tailored white, a stark contrast to the gray, rainy morning outside. She didn't look at the reception desk where Emily, the terrified assistant, sat trembling. She walked straight to the double doors of the CEO's office. The doors were locked. Richard had evidently taken the key, a final, petty act of defiance. "Kick it in?" Tobias suggested, his voice low. "No," Charlotte said, her voice calm and terrifyingly devoid of emotion. "Call maintenance. Have them remove the doors entirely. We won't be needing secrets in this office anymore." Within 10 minutes, the doors were off their hinges. Charlotte walked into the sanctum Richard had built to worship himself. It smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive cologne. The walls were lined with framed magazine covers, Wired, Forbes, Fortune, all featuring Richard's smiling face. Charlotte walked over to the massive mahogany desk. She ran a finger along the edge. Dust. "Tobias," she said without turning around, "have everything in this room boxed up. Send the personal items to Richard's mother's house in Ohio. Burn the rest." "Even the awards?" Tobias asked, gesturing to the Innovator of the Year trophy on the mantel. "Especially the awards," Charlotte replied. "He didn't earn them. He bought them with money he stole from the R&D budget." She sat down in the leather chair. It was too big, designed for a man who needed to feel large. She adjusted the height, swiveled to face the window, and looked out at the city that Richard had claimed was his. "Get the board in here," she ordered. Now. The meeting with the board of directors was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Samuel Dawson, Linda Way, and Thomas O'Malley filed in like students called to the principal's office. These were titans of industry, people who managed billions of dollars, yet they refused to make eye contact with the woman sitting at the head of the table. They expected screaming. They expected a scorned ex-wife venting 20 years of frustration. Instead, they got a CFO. "Please, sit," Charlotte said, gesturing to the chairs. She didn't offer coffee. "Charlotte," Dawson began, his voice trembling slightly, "we want to assure you that the board was unaware of the extent of Richard's malfeasance. We were misled." "You weren't misled, Samuel," Charlotte cut him off, her voice cool. "You were lazy. You saw the profit margins hitting 20% and you stopped asking questions. You let Richard treat the company credit card like a personal piggy bank because the stock price kept climbing." She slid a folder across the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "This," she said, "is a list of the shell companies Richard used to funnel money to his mistress, Jessica, under the guise of marketing consulting. Over $4 million in 2 years. And you signed off on every single audit." Linda Way turned pale. We assumed it was a legitimate vendor." "You assumed," Charlotte repeated. "And because you assumed, the SEC is currently debating whether to indict the entire board for negligence. However," she let the word hang in the air. The 3 directors leaned forward, desperate for a lifeline. "I have spoken to the prosecutors," Charlotte continued, folding her hands. "I have agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation into Richard's personal finances. In exchange, they are willing to view the company and its board as victims of his fraud, rather than accomplices. Provided, of course, that we make immediate structural changes." "Anything," O'Malley grunted. "Name it." "First," Charlotte said, counting on her fingers, "we rebrand. The name Jessica is poison. As of tomorrow, we are Aegis Dynamics. We focus on data security and ethical AI. No more consumer spyware. No more aggressive data harvesting." "Agreed," Dawson said quickly. "Second," Charlotte continued, "I want Artie Pendleton's law firm fired. I want every contract they touched reviewed by an independent counsel. And I want a civil suit filed against Richard for the recovery of the $4 million he embezzled." "Done," Way nodded. "And third," Charlotte said, her eyes hardening, "I want his severance package canceled. The golden parachute he negotiated, the $20 million, Void it under the bad actor clause. But, Dawson hesitated, he'll sue. He needs that money for his defense. Let him sue, Charlotte said, a small, cold smile touching her lips. He can sue me with the public defender. He'll be qualified for once I freeze his remaining assets. The board members looked at each other. They realized then that Richard had been the noise, but Charlotte had always been the signal. They nodded in unison. Good, Charlotte said, standing up. Now, get out of my office. I have work to do. 3 weeks later, Richard Jessica sat in a small, windowless interview room at the Federal Detention Center in Brooklyn. He looked like a ghost. He had lost 20 pounds. His hair, usually dyed and coiffed, was gray and thinning. He wore an orange jumpsuit that clashed violently with his pale skin. Across the metal table sat his new lawyer, a court-appointed attorney named Mr. Henderson, who looked overworked and smelled of stale coffee. It's not good, Richard, Henderson said, shuffling through a stack of papers. The forensic evidence Charlotte provided is overwhelming. The trust documents, the bank transfers, the emails, where you explicitly told Artie to hide the money where she can't find it. It's all there. She can't do this, Richard whispered. His voice was raspy. I built that company. I am a genius. You're a defendant, Henderson corrected him bluntly. And right now, you're a broke defendant. The judge denied bail because of the flight risk. And Charlotte, Miss Jessica, has successfully petitioned to have your assets frozen, pending the outcome of the civil suit. What about Jessica? Richard asked, a flicker of hope in his eyes. She has money. I gave her millions. She can post bail. Henderson sighed. He pulled a tabloid newspaper from his briefcase and slid it across the table. The headline read, Confessions of a Billionaire's Mistress. How I Helped the FBI Catch Richard Jessica. Below it was a picture of Jessica, looking glamorous in oversized sunglasses, leaving the district attorney's office. She cut a deal, Richard, Henderson said softly. Immunity in exchange for testimony. She gave them your hard drives. She gave them the passwords to the crypto accounts. She gave them everything. Richard stared at the photo. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for. The woman he had bought a yacht for. She hadn't just left him. She had sold him out to save her own skin. He put his head in his hands. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't a weapon he used against others. It was a weight crushing him. I called her powerless, he muttered, a tear leaking onto the metal table. I told her she was nothing. Well, Henderson said, packing up his briefcase. It seems she disagreed. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Charlotte stood on the balcony of the new Aegis Dynamics headquarters. It was a crisp autumn evening. The city lights of Manhattan glittered below like spilled diamonds. The company's stock had not just recovered, it had doubled. The market loved the redemption arc. They loved the story of the brilliant woman stepping out of the shadows to save the empire from the corrupt tyrant. Charlotte had been featured on the cover of Time magazine. The headline simply read, The Cleanup. But Charlotte didn't care about the press. She cared about the ledger. And for the first time in 20 years, the ledger was balanced. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her daughter, Maya, who was in her first semester at Harvard Law. Saw the news about Dad's sentencing. 8 years? Are you okay, Mom? Charlotte looked at the screen. She felt a phantom pang of sadness, not for the man Richard had become, but for the man he could have been if his ego hadn't devoured him. But the sadness was fleeting, washed away by the clarity of her freedom. She typed back, I'm fine, sweetheart. Justice is a long game. Study hard. Love you. She put the phone away and turned back to the party inside. It was a celebration for the launch of the new security protocol. Version 6, built entirely on her code, legally and ethically. Tobias Grayson was there, holding a glass of champagne. He walked over to her, clinking his glass against hers. To the victor, he said quietly. To the architect, Charlotte corrected him with a smile. You know, Tobias said, looking out at the skyline. Artie Pendleton is working as a paralegal in New Jersey now. He got disbarred last week. I heard, Charlotte said. And Jessica? She's doing a reality TV show about surviving a toxic billionaire. It's getting terrible ratings. Charlotte laughed. It was a genuine, warm sound, a sound she hadn't made in years. They're all just noise, Tobias, she said. Let them have their noise. We have the work. She took a sip of champagne. It tasted like victory. It tasted like autonomy. Richard had told her to go find a hobby. He had told her to knit. Instead, she had unraveled his entire life, thread by thread, and knitted a new one for herself out of the wreckage. She turned her back on the city and walked into the warmth of the room, ready to lead. She was no longer Charlotte the wife, Charlotte the victim, or Charlotte the quiet one. She was Charlotte Jessica. And she was just getting started. And that is how the story ends. Richard Jessica lost his freedom, his fortune, and his reputation, all because he underestimated the woman he slept next to for 20 years. He thought silence was weakness, but Charlotte proved that silence is where you sharpen your knives. It's a powerful lesson about loyalty and respect. Charlotte didn't want to destroy him initially, she just wanted what was fair. But when you back a smart person into a corner, don't be surprised when they come out swinging with everything they have. What do you think? Was an 8-year prison sentence enough for Richard, or did he get off easy? And would you have forgiven Jessica for flipping on him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of corporate revenge and justice, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more real-life drama stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.